أشكركم على الحضور. أنا اسمي أحمد ندوة. بشتغل مدير تنفيذي لكوميتي فور جاستس. والنهارده هحاول إني أوضح لحضراتكم بعض الانتهاكات اللي بتحدث داخل السجون ومراكز الاحتجاز المصرية، وبالأخص جريمة التعذيب والأوضاع التي ترتبت على هذه الجريمة من عدم مساءلة وإفلات من العقاب. في البداية هناك سياسة تتبعها الحكومة المصرية في تعاملها مع الجرائم داخل السجون ومراكز الاحتجاز المصرية، ألا وهي سياسة الإنكار والتجاهل والعقاب في مواجهة جرائم التعذيب بداخل السجون ومراكز الاحتجاز المختلفة. وفي اعتقادي أن النظام المصري استمر في اتباع هذه السياسة، سياسة الإنكار والتجاهل لجرائم التعذيب وانتهاكات حقوق الإنسان بداخل السجون ومراكز الاحتجاز المختلفة، وإنها كانت أساس لإفلات مرتكبي هذه الجرائم من منتسبي وأعضاء جهاز الشرطة المصرية وأجهزة المخابرات المصرية والجيش المصري. وللأسف الشديد حتى الآن أستطيع أن أقول أن هناك سياسة الإفلات من العقاب هي الأساس في التعامل مع هذه الانتهاكات. وأستطيع أني أدلل على هذا الأمر بحالتين. الحالة الأولى هي الحالة الخاصة بتعذيب عدد من أفراد مدنيين بداخل قسم شرطة دار السلام، واللي وثقتها وأظهرتها للعلن جريدة الجارديان البريطانية في بداية العام 2022. للأسف الشديد السلطات المصرية في قيامها بالتحقيق في هذه الجريمة البشعة، واللي على أساسها كان هناك تعذيب لعدد من المواطنين المدنيين في جرائم ليست ما بين قوسين سياسية، أشخاص عاديين وليسوا معارضين، حينما فقط استغاثوا وأظهروا عدد من الانتهاكات أو التعذيب الذي مورس عليهم داخل السجون ومراكز داخل سجن دار السلام. كان تعامل الحكومة المصرية مع هذه الجريمة هو التجاهل التام والقيام بمعاقبة هؤلاء الأشخاص والتحقيق معهم بسبب أنهم قاموا بإظهار معلومات غير صحيحة وإعلان وقائع غير صحيحة، وتم معاقبة هؤلاء الأشخاص الذين استغاثوا من التعذيب بداخل قسم دار السلام بالسجن أمام محكمة جنايات الدورة تحت زعم إشاعة أخبار كاذبة. الحالة الثانية اللي ممكن إني أدلل عليها على اتباع الحكومة المصرية لسياسة الإنكار والتجاهل والعقاب بشأن جريمة التعذيب هي حالة الباحث الاقتصادي وعضو حزب الإصلاح والتنمية أيمن هدهود، اللي للأسف الشديد بعد أن تم إلقاء القبض عليه وتم إيداعه أحد أقسام أو أحد أماكن جهاز الأمن الوطني لفترة معينة للتحقيق معه في قيامه بإعداد عدد من الأبحاث حول الوضع الاقتصادي في مصر. هذا الباحث ظهر بعد ذلك بعد عدة أيام أعلنت وفاته من قبل وزارة الداخلية تحت تأثير التعذيب وسوء المعاملة أثناء احتجازه. وعلى الرغم من أن هذه القضية كانت قضية رأي عام لشخص معروف بانتمائه السياسي وعضويته الحزب الشرعي في مصر، إلا أن سلطات التحقيق المصرية للأسف الشديد لم تقم فقط بالتحقيق في هذه الواقعة وإظهار الأشخاص الذين ارتكبوا جريمة التعذيب ومقتل هذا الباحث بداخل أحد أقسام الشرطة، لكنها أظهرت وأنكرت وأبلغت الرأي العام في العديد من وسائل التواصل وبيانات وزارة الداخلية بأنه مات موتة طبيعية، وأنه لا توجد أي أثر من آثار التعذيب ضده، على الرغم من أن الصور التي ظهرت لجثمانه أوضحت بشكل كبير أن هناك تعذيب مورس ضد هذا الشخص وتعذيب بشع للغاية. الأمر فقط من وجهة نظرنا لم يقف على اتباع سياسة، هذه السياسة في مواجهة جرائم التعذيب داخل مصر، وإنما تعدت هذه السياسة إلى أن تكون أمام آليات الأمم المتحدة وغيرها من آليات المحاسبة، واللي ظهرت في الاستعراض الخاص بالعهد الدولي للحقوق المدنية والسياسية اللي كان في أوائل هذا الشهر أمام لجنة حقوق الإنسان بالأمم المتحدة، واللي للأسف الشديد على لسان المتحدث باسم النيابة العامة المصرية أنكر وجود أي جريمة للتعذيب، وأن النيابة العامة المصرية تقوم بالتحقيق في وقائع التعذيب. وديت كانت الفيديو والمداخلة بتاعته التي أنكر فيها أي واقعة تعذيب أو أن الحكومة المصرية لا تحقق في وقائع التعذيب أمام لجنة حقوق الإنسان في الأمم المتحدة مع بداية هذا الشهر.
وبشأن ما أثير عن التعذيب وغيره من ضروب المعاملة أو العقوبة القاسية أو اللا إنسانية أو المهينة، ففضلا عما تضمنه تقرير جمهورية مصر العربية الدوري الخامس، فيؤكد الوفد المصري بأن النيابة العامة في مصر تقوم بالتحقيق الدوري والشامل والمحايد في جميع ادعاءات التعذيب وسوء المعاملة، وذلك وفقا لنص الدستور والقوانين ذات الصلة بوصفها هي سلطة التحقيق القضائية المستقلة والمحايدة والموضوعية ذات الولاية الممتدة لكل أنواع الجرائم. وتتلقى النيابة العامة كافة البلاغات ذات الصلة بالادعاء بالتعرض للتعذيب أو غيره من ضروب المعاملة القاسية أو اللا إنسانية، سواء وردت بشكل مباشر من المجني عليهم بتقدمهم بالإبلاغ عنها سواء ورقيا أو رقميا، أو وردت عرضا أثناء استجوابها للأشخاص، وتتخذ الإجراءات القانونية في هذا الخصوص في ضوء ما تسفر عنه التحقيقات، بما في ذلك الإحالة إلى المحاكمة الجنائية إذا ما ثبت صحتها وفق صحيح الإجراءات القانونية. وفي هذا الشأن تقدر الإشارة إلى أن النيابة العامة تقوم في جميع الأحوال بمناظرة عموم جسد المتهمين المعروضين عليها بما لا يستطيل إلى عوراتهم، وإثبات ما يعن لها من ملاحظات في هذا الشأن في التحقيق. وتقوم أيضا النيابة العامة في كل تحقيقاتها بسؤال كافة المتهمين المعروضين عليها عن وجود أي إصابات بهم ومناظرتهم على ما سبق توضيحه وفقا للقانون لبيان إذا ما كانت بهم إضافة.
ده كان رد النيابة العامة المصرية حول وقائع التعذيب والأسئلة حول ارتكاب جرائم التعذيب داخل السجون ومراكز الاحتجاز أمام لجنة حقوق الإنسان مع بداية هذا الشهر. للأسف الشديد في نهاية كلمتي أستطيع أني أقول أن اتباع سياسة الإنكار وعدم التحقيق الجدي والتعامل مع الإفلات من العقاب والعمل على مساعدة منتسبي جهاز الشرطة المصرية وجهاز الجيش المصري وأجهزة المخابرات المصرية في عدم مساءلتهم وعدم إعطاء العدالة للضحايا، أعتقد بأن هذا الأمر للأسف الشديد أثمر عن سياسة عديدة وارتكاب العديد من جرائم التعذيب خلال العام 2022، واللي للأسف لن يؤدي بحال من الأحوال إلى أي مساءلة أو أي عدالة للضحايا. وده الأمر اللي بنحاول إننا نوضحه بشكل كبير، ونطالب الحكومة المصرية أن تعمل على تعديل سلوكها والعمل على إعطاء العدالة لضحايا حقوق الإنسان وضحايا جريمة التعذيب داخل السجون ومراكز الاحتجاز. وشكرا لحضرتك.
Thank you, Member, for speaking through the scale and the scope of the issue. I'm going to hand now to Alison McManus to talk about her work on sexual violence in detention settings.
Thanks so much, Sophie. Thanks also to the organizers, to Dignity, and thanks especially to Mefra and Lotfi for your courage in speaking up about these violations. I'm very humbled to be here today. I'm going to follow up with Mefra's intervention and tell 3 additional stories of prisoners. The first is Dr. Saif Fatin. Dr. Saif Fatin is a father of 7 and a professor of environmental engineering who was trained at MIT in the United States. On November 13th, 2018, police raided his home, threw him in the back of a police car, put a hood over his head, and brought him to the basement of a National Security Agency facility, where he would spend 265 days blindfolded, not permitted any contact with his family or lawyer, not even permitted to use his own name, facing interrogations, electrocutions, and other forms of psychological torture and abuse. Dr. Mohammed Anaka is a veterinarian, an environmental activist, and an advocate for the forcibly disappeared. He's been in prison several times for his activism, including in reprisal for his work engaging with the UN special mechanisms. During his latest detention in 2020, he was disappeared for 25 days, beaten to the point of breaking ribs. He was sodomized, electrocuted in his genitals, and officers threatened to rape his wife until finally he submitted a forced confession. Abdurrahman al-Shoaib is a 30-year-old prisoner in Minya prison. In April 2021, he detailed in a letter that was smuggled to his mother that he had been tortured by a cellmate and prison officers. They hung him in his cell and sexually assaulted him in several ways. When his mother filed a complaint to the prosecutor and shared her son's story on Facebook, the whole family was arrested. Al-Shoaib continues to be brutalized in prison. Most recently, we've heard that he was stripped naked, beaten, and forced to relieve himself in front of his cellmates. His mom remains in prison also. I'm sharing these stories to illustrate several points that I believe are critical to understanding the nature of torture and impunity in Egypt today. 1, torture is systemic and part of the state's logic of control over the civilian population. 2, torture is systematic, and particularly during periods of enforced disappearance, takes place almost without exception. Number 3, the National Security Agency officers are most often, though not exclusively, responsible for directing or overseeing acts of torture. To the first point, my colleagues at the Freedom Initiative, along with other colleagues in Egyptian society, conducted in-depth research on the state's use of sexual violence as a form of torture. We documented 655 cases of sexual violence throughout the experience of detention committed against cis and trans men and women alike. It's important to consider why sexual violence is predominant as a form of torture. In addition to physical punishment, the state directs and condones acts of sexual violence because the stigma associated with them causes maximum psychological pain and will act as a deterrent against victims speaking out about the torture that they've endured. To the second point about torture taking place during periods of enforced disappearance, of the 655 cases that we documented, 523 cases of sexual violence took place in National Security Agency sites during periods of enforced disappearance. This means that the torture occurs in the absence of a lawyer, in the absence of any contact with the outside world, and officers regularly will prevent detainees from re-emerging until all physical evidence that might be documented in order to seek accountability later has disappeared from their bodies. Further, Egyptian law does not explicitly criminalize enforced disappearance, nor is Egypt party to the International Convention on the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance, placing further obstacles to accountability. Thirdly, on the role of National Security Agency officers. Their presence in detention centers is highly informalized, and they act as a kind of shadow in plain sight. Officers often obscure their faces and names, using multiple false names, making the identification of perpetrators particularly difficult. In 1996, the UN Committee Against Torture's inquiry on Egypt concluded, quote, "The committee is forced to conclude that torture is systematically practiced by the security forces in Egypt, in particular by state security intelligence." And I'll remind the audience here that the NSA, as it's currently constituted, represents state security as it was reconstituted after the 2011 revolution. The CAT expressed its concern that the state security premises were sites of torture because, as, quote, "These places are not included in one of the categories of places of detention specified in the Organization of Prisons Act. They are not subject to inspections and investigations concerning allegation of torture." 30 years later, that is still the case. Last May, Egypt boasted amendments to its Organizations of Prisons Act, but did not address secret detention facilities. Now it calls prisons rehabilitation centers. Over the past year, much of the prison population has been moved to these new facilities, along with the same National Security Agency officers responsible for abuses. And already detainees at the new Badr Rehabilitation Center have reported acts of abuse, including sexual assaults. However, they've been denied their rights to hearings, conditions that have led to a wave of suicide attempts, and currently prisoners are engaged in strikes and other forms of resistance to demand improved conditions because they have no other recourse. So I'll conclude by emphasizing that for over 30 years there has been no real accountability for acts of torture in Egypt. Again, in 2017, the CAT inquiry on torture concluded that, quote, "Perpetrators of torture almost universally enjoy impunity." In this light, a movement for international accountability is critical. This should include support for the establishment of an independent human rights monitoring mechanism at the Human Rights Council, as well as demands for greater transparency into detention centers, including informal places of detention. While these steps may be only a start, without any start, we'll surely face another generation of torture with impunity. Thank you.
Thank you, Alison, for highlighting that historic pattern and the widespread use of sexual violence. We're going to hear now a video intervention from Alessandra Ballerini, so I'll pass to my colleague to my left. And the video should include subtitles.
Buonasera a tutti. Parlando di impunità, di gravi violazioni dei diritti umani, non possiamo non parlare di Giulio Regeni e della battaglia giudiziaria che i suoi genitori e migliaia di cittadini in tutto il mondo stanno portando avanti ininterrottamente da 7 anni. Come saprete, noi abbiamo i nomi di 4 imputati, 4 tra i molti responsabili del sequestro, delle torture e della deliberata uccisione del ricercatore Giulio Regeni. I nomi di questi 4 persone sono Tariq Sabir, Hattar Kamel Mohamed Ibrahim, Hussein Helmi, Magdi Ibrahim Abdelal Sharif. Anche se abbiamo i nomi di queste 4 persone e sappiamo a grandi linee cosa hanno fatto su Giulio, anche se abbiamo i numeri delle loro tessere identificative, non abbiamo ancora potuto iniziare un processo in Italia. E questo perché queste 4 persone, con la complicità del governo egiziano, si sottraggono al processo, si nascondono vigliaccamente e si rifiutano di eleggere un domicilio in Italia. L'elezione di questo domicilio consentirebbe la notifica degli atti e quindi di avviare un regolare processo. Queste 4 persone fanno finta di non sapere che c'è un processo a loro carico, pur essendo tutti alti funzionari della National Security ed avendo addirittura uno di loro collaborato sulle indagini dell'uccisione di Giulio. E non si fanno trovare, pur lavorando tutti per il governo egiziano. Il governo di al-Sisi ha promesso e continua a promettere, ancora oggi, continua a promettere al nostro governo che collaborerà perché il processo possa iniziare, perché si possa avere una verità processuale sul sequestro, le torture e l'uccisione di Giulio. Ma nei fatti così non è, anzi è esattamente il contrario. Il procuratore capo egiziano ha depositato una memoria nel nostro tribunale dicendo che non ha assolutamente intenzione di collaborare perché per loro quelle 4 persone sono innocenti e non vogliono che nessun altro tribunale, anche di altri paesi, li possa processare. Quindi di fatto il governo egiziano continua a prendere in giro noi tutti cittadini, non solo la famiglia di Giulio, e continua a garantire l'impunità per chi ha sequestrato, torturato e ucciso Giulio Regeni. Io credo, come difensora dei diritti umani, prima ancora che come avvocata della famiglia Regeni, che non si possono fare accordi con governi che garantiscono l'impunità per chi tortura e uccide, con governi che sono complici di torturatori e assassini. Mi viene in mente che tra poco, il 24 marzo, sarà la giornata dichiarata dall'ONU per il diritto alla verità. Questo è un diritto inalienabile che spetta a ogni cittadino e che spetta in particolare ai familiari di vittime di gravissime violazioni dei diritti umani. E credo che l'unico modo per celebrare la giornata del diritto alla verità sia pretendere verità nei confronti di chi tortura e uccide ancora impunemente. Grazie.
So with that video, we've really highlighted the ongoing struggle that the regime family are facing in their pursuit for accountability. And with that, I'm going to pass to my colleague Grant from Dignity, who's going to expand on the case further.
Thank you. Like Sophie mentioned, I want to highlight not only the fact that torture is systemic and systematic in Egypt, but also that impunity is systemic and systematic. The brief background on the case of Giulio Regeni. Giulio was kidnapped, tortured, and murdered in late January or early February 2016. Shortly after the crimes against him, there was a brief period of joint investigation by the Italian and Egyptian authorities. So much so that the Egyptian prosecutor at the time even said that they do not rule out any possibility of state involvement. Very quickly thereafter, the Egyptian authorities changed their tune, and all sorts of outlandish theories about what happened ultimately to Giorgio began surfacing. Nevertheless, the Italian authorities continued with their investigation, and despite Egyptian obstruction at every single turn, a few years ago had compiled enough evidence to issue indictments against the four named individuals from Ms. Ballerini. This indictment is remarkable, and it's remarkable because ordinarily Italian judges have no business saying what happens in Egypt committed by Egyptian people. It's not how the international legal system works. But of course, Giulio was an Italian national, and he was the victim of international crimes, the most grotesque international crimes, very much making this a case of Italian business, very much putting this within Italy's interest. And just because Italy is able to exercise jurisdiction in the case doesn't mean that they must also exercise jurisdiction in a way that guarantees fair trial. Notwithstanding the heinous nature of the crimes, Italy is still bound by its own fair trial standards, by its own human rights standards, to try the four named individuals fairly. That includes things like a presumption of innocence. That includes things like giving them access to, making sure they have access to legal counsel. That includes things like making sure that there's a notification of the charges against them. And this is where the case is getting hung up, and this is where it highlights how very cynical the Egyptian authorities are in obstructing justice for this case. As I mentioned, throughout the investigation and after the charges, at every single turn, the Egyptian authorities have obstructed justice for Regini and on behalf of the Italian authorities. All that is needed in order for the case to move forward is for the Italian authorities to be able to serve notice of the case against those four named individuals. The Italian statute requires that that be served at the places in which these individuals live, at their home. That's why Ms. Ballerini was referring to election of domicile. At no point have the Egyptian authorities cooperated with any request from the Italian authorities, as Ms. Ballerini points out. I want to reframe what it is I'm saying. You have state security officials, people operating in their capacity as representatives of Egyptians' national security, allegedly committing international crimes, and you have the very same state they represent obstructing justice for that crime by taking advantage of fair trial human rights standards. It's the Egyptian authorities weaponizing the human rights system against itself to enshrine impunity for those acting on its behalf. Torture in Egypt is systematic. Torture in Egypt is systemic. They're not cynically using human rights to guard bad apples. They're cynically using human rights to systemically shield the torture occurring in Egypt. Ought it not be the case that this case can move forward? Ought it not be the situation that this case moves forward because of this cynicism? Shouldn't the Italian authorities, shouldn't the Italian judiciary, shouldn't fair trial standards more generally permit the exercise of jurisdiction where there's state obstruction of state perpetration of Jus Cogens violations, of gross international crimes of the most heinous sort? One of the reasons why I bring this up is because I'm not only thinking about Egypt, I'm thinking about other contexts wherein there's gross human rights violations. I'm thinking about Ukraine, I'm thinking about Afghanistan, I'm thinking about Ethiopia, you name it, the Human Rights Council's full of it. I'm thinking about all these other places, institutions wherein the state enshrines impunity. What's at stake here is the cynical weaponization of the human rights system against itself to prop up and allow for a system of widespread and systematic torture in Egypt. It's an honor to share the panel with my fellow colleagues. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Graham, for reminding us of the extent of the obstruction in that case. Now, Lutfi will be speaking briefly to conclude our remarks for today, and then we'll have some time for questions afterwards.
Thank you. It's a great honor for me to be able to attend this side event. most Egyptian human rights defenders or directors of human rights organizations have been subjected over the past 7 years or so to a travel ban. And therefore, I hope by speaking here, I am carrying some of their voices as well and conveying messages that they would have liked also to convey. Impunity is the only certain aspect of violations that one is sure of when violations happen. The government of Egypt, through its policies of massive violations, whether it's arbitrary arrests, disappearances, torture, as an NGO, we document those violations. We may have our doubts when we gather testimonies, but once we are sure of a case, that once we know that this person has been tortured or has disappeared, we are sure and certain that the perpetrator who has done this violation, that has done this harm to the victims, will go unpunished. We know it. We still litigate, we still present evidences, we still take legal action and campaign on behalf of the victims. But we know very well that the person who committed the crime of torture will go unpunished, especially if this person belongs to the national security apparatus or the military intelligence apparatus. Small sub-officers may come sometimes under prosecution and then get away because they're able to threaten a family of the victim, for example, or rearrest the person who has complained, the victim of torture who has complained of torture. But even there, my colleague Ahmed Befra has presented the case of Al Salam police station. That's a regular police station, not national security. The victims are ordinary Egyptians. They have filmed their testimony about the torture they were subjected to, and yet they were the ones punished altogether for this and put on trial and sentenced to prison. The immediate circle of support for victims of torture to seek remedy, to seek justice, is family. It's usually family. And families who encourage their loved ones to take legal action, to speak up about those violations, can quickly be themselves victims too. And we have seen this repeat many, many times. Alison has mentioned the case of Abdurrahman al-Shuwaif and his mom. His mom received a letter from her loved son telling her he was sexually assaulted. She went and she spoke about that. She went herself after the visit to his prison in Kenya to the prosecutor. She didn't wait for a lawyer. She went on her own and she made a complaint. In the night, next day, she was on TV. The day after, we were speaking about the kind of legal aid we could provide her to follow up on that complaint that she just did. In the morning, she was arrested, and she's still not her own. His father was also arrested, and his sister was also arrested. They were later released, but his mother, Huda Abdul Hamid, is still in detention until now. We have lawyer Ibrahim Mitwalli, who, by the way, was arrested while coming to Geneva at Cairo Airport in September 2017. That's 6 years ago. 6 years of pretrial detention. Because he wanted to come to speak about his son who disappeared back in 2013. And so for 4 years, he has been trying to find his son, who disappeared in a protest back in 2013. And no answers. He decided to okay, the working group on enforcement disappearance of the UN, was invited by the working group. He had his ticket, he had his invitation to come to the UN to speak, like I'm doing now, and he was arrested at the airport. He was himself, and he was accused of founding an illegal organization, that's the league or association of the family that disappeared. And he's in jail until now, without a sentence. I have Azzam Ghunaim, another lawyer from the Egyptian Coordination for Rights and Freedoms. He was presented to court, an emergency court, and he was sentenced recently to 15 years prison for founding an illegal organization, illegal group, terrorist group or terror group, and spreading false information undermining national security. Another one, a lawyer, also Mohammed Bakr, who used to be the director of the Adala Center for Rights and Freedoms, whose offices it was across the road from our NGO, was arrested, and for 2 years we didn't know why. He was accused of belonging to a terror group and spreading false information. He never knew what was this false information, nor what was this group, just like thousands of Egyptians were accused of the same things and who don't know. And finally, he was sent to an emergency court, along with Salah Al-Fatah, Muhammad Oxygen, a journalist. And finally, he learned in court what is this false information he was accused of. And it happens to be a post by Adala Center on their Facebook page speaking about the death of 2 men jailed in Torah high security prison in Cairo. It happens to be the same prison he was detained in during his trial. These are examples of impunity and reprisals and attacks against the enablers, the families, the lawyers, the NGOs who try to help